Nowhere in the pages of history can one find a greater champion of justice. Return with us now to those thrilling days of yesteryear.
And I'll tell you something else, too, is I cannot stand sissies.
You're going to talk about wrestling, that's redneck talk.
And guess what, fatso? I'm the world champion.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to hour number 81 of the 1,000 Hours podcast series. I am your host, Carl Stern. This podcast is produced and distributed by WhenItWasCool.com and heard at WrestlingObserver.com, Figure4Online.com, WhenItWasCool.com, anywhere reputable podcasts are, YouTube, Apple, Spotify. Well, we should be there too. And we have an extended edition of the show available only to our Patreon supporters at When It Was Cool, where we go over and speak about more about the topic, or perhaps sometimes a different topic. But the 1,000 Hour series is all about the pioneer era of pro wrestling. This is professional wrestling before the year 1900, generally speaking. The text of this show right now is coming from my latest book, which is DragonKingKarl's Pioneer Era of Pro Wrestling Omnibus. It's available from Amazon. You can get the link straight there from the front page of When It Was Cool, and it's all about the Pioneer Era. This show is sponsored, and the sponsor for this episode is PGI86. Thank you very much. They became a Patreon supporter at When It Was Cool, and when you do that, we dedicate an hour of this show to you, and that's how we keep it going. And if you're already a Patreon supporter or you just want to support this show, there is a PayPal and a Cash app link on the front page of When It Was Cool. You can make a donation there. Anything $10 or more, you get an episode of the show dedicated to you. So we got some interesting stuff today. So we're going to deviate a little bit from what we normally do here. We are going to the book. We are covering the timeline. But I've got some emails here that I'd really like to get to from some wrestling historians. And you've heard me mention Jason Campbell many times in the past. He has the ProWrestlingHistory.com website. He's been extraordinarily helpful throughout any type of research I do, but especially speaking of the Pioneer Era stuff. He does a lot of research up in the Ohio area on all sorts of wrestling history, and anytime he comes across something interesting from the Pioneer Era, he oftentimes sends it to me. I'm very grateful for that. And also some files today from an author named Jimmy Wheeler, and Jimmy Wheeler is a great wrestling historian. Also, you may have seen his work online. He oftentimes, he's like me. He really researches the deep parts of wrestling history, the way on back there. And so anytime you see Jimmy Wheeler's name attached to a project, it's probably pretty good. And he had, some time back, had told me he was going to send me what files he had on Homer Lane. And if you recall, we talked quite a bit about Homer Lane. He's one of the early American heavyweight champions. He's got a long career. He's going to be around all the way up, basically until the end of the Pioneer Era. He's one of the first and one of the last guys to leave. So, Homer Lane kind of doesn't get his just due, I believe. The first one I want to take a look at here comes from Jason, and he's was researching the Cincinnati Enquirer from 1884, and this note comes from June 14th, 1884, and it involves Duncan C. Ross, which we're now getting into the Duncan C. Ross era, starting a few episodes ago. Duncan C. Ross comes along. Now, Duncan C. Ross, for the context of this show, if you've been listening to the show chronologically, you may not have learned or heard that much about him yet. You will. He's a very prominent wrestler in this era. We're just getting into his time period. He was also a master swordsman as well. They would do these broadsword exhibitions. Several of the, well, I say several, at least a few of the wrestlers. I think Captain J.C. Dally also, and Duncan C. Ross, and I believe a couple more were also considered expert swordsmen. And it's not unusual. Look, as long as pro wrestling's been around, there have been crossover athletes with other sports. Obviously, football, American football, is one where pro wrestling's got a lot of wrestlers over the years, and mixed martial arts and various martial arts, especially you go back, as martial arts have largely conglomerated into MMA, UFC fighting. We know, however, that wasn't always the case before the summer of 1994 when UFC 1 took place. It really gave a huge change in how martial arts were practiced and advertised and believed in the faith in these martial arts. All really kind of changed, and you saw a big difference now. Where when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, there were, what largely became known as, quote, McDojos everywhere. There were Taekwondo studios. I have a black belt in Tang Soo Do, which is a close relation to Tang Soo Do. And so those were around a lot. And then before that, in the 70s, you got the immediate post-Bruce Lee era where he was a huge movie star. There were lots of martial arts, kung fu, karate movies being made. And all those had influence in some way or form, either on a particular wrestler or a style of wrestling. And so it's often been strongman, of course. The strongest man in the world gimmick's been around since the Pioneer era, and many people over the years have used it. Jason's article says here, from the Cincinnati Enquirer, during an intermission, the audience was treated to some native Indian wrestling. The contestants being Ouray, a chief of the Apaches, and Little Buffalo, a Comanche chief. They are from the troupe which has been showing at the People's Museum. They were wrestling a sort of collar and elbow, but do not use trips. They simply throw and swing around until one falls. Ouray threw Little Buffalo in 5 minutes. And look, this Indian style, there were certainly Indian wrestling styles. There's no question. Mostly dating back, these would have been seen in the time of Abe Lincoln before wrestling got really, worked and became what we've seen it become here in the Pioneer era. Different styles of Indian wrestling. We talked a little bit about this when we talked about Davy Crockett on one of our earlier shows too. So it's a thing that existed, but it may not be, this presentation may depend on where you are. We talked previously about Sorikichi Matsuda and his, quote, Japanese style, which was essentially sumo. Jason says, speaking of styles, about a month later is the first appearance in Cincinnati of Matsuda Sorikichi. He lost a mixed-style match with Joe Acton, and another person we're just now starting to talk some about. The, quote, Japanese style fall sounds like sumo rules, and yeah, most all the examples I've seen also appear to be sumo. They were wearing a peculiar kind of scarf harness around their waist, and I don't know exactly what that could have been. There were oftentimes or I should say many times, they would experiment with these different harnesses and contraptions. I've often compared it to like judo jackets in judo, but there were specific harnesses for collar and elbow, so this doesn't surprise me really. Jason says this also. I started following up on the article that said Duncan C. Ross was going into the ministry. Now, this is something that's very interesting. I'm glad Jason sent this, because in the book, if you follow the Dragon King Karl's Pioneer Era Pro Wrestling Omnibus, you'll see that Duncan C. Ross, as he's becoming more and more a well-known champion throughout the United States, getting more and more press, he up and decides to become a minister. And it's hard to tell if he was sincere or this was a gimmick, part of a new way of, let's just be honest, making money, or if he was sincere, or even how long it lasted. Because to me, it didn't seem like it lasted. It seemed like he got really, really into religion for a short period of time and may have been really, really sincere. It's hard to tell, but this is what Jason found. He said, considering he'd still be working matches to fleece bettors out of money, it made me doubt his sincerity. But as I started searching for his name outside of Ohio, interesting articles kept appearing. And these are just the ones that also had ministry mentioned somewhere else on the page. Similar versions of the articles below ended up in papers throughout the United States and sometimes even in other countries. Since it's so long, the last article for the third match in the sword fight series is attached as a PDF. A few interesting takeaways, and we may not go through all this, but here's interesting takeaways. Jason thinks, and this is very timely, it's a Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame season. I have not got my ballot yet. I'm usually in the second set of ballots that go. For whatever reason, Dave sends these out in multiple waves. I've noticed every year mine's generally not in the first set that goes out, but about a week or so. So I'm expecting my ballot any day, and often we discuss, are there any pioneers who should be in? So of course, I led the campaign to get Colonel James H. McLaughlin in, and that was successful. Many others, Frank Gotch, Evan Lewis, others are in there. I've been sort of thinking about Professor Thiebaud Bauer, but I may want to push that to next year. The Jimmy Wheeler, who I'm talking about, we're going to talk about in a moment on the show, I think is working on a project related to him, so I may want to see how that goes. But Jason mentions Duncan C. Ross, and maybe that's something we need to look at here. He says he may be a Hall of Fame level star. Thinking at some point I need to start researching his entire career and make the case for his induction. I would be interested in helping out what I can there. Jason says the articles go back and forth about him getting into the ministry. I wonder if it was his doing, just keeping his name out in the papers. Then he says 3. The 3-series sword fights with Captain Jennings certainly sounds a lot like a wrestling program. The benefit show for Jennings, which I've seen quite a few times in wrestling of the time period, and the impromptu match with his second in the last match leads me to believe it's a work. And I've always, well, I won't say always, as I've come to research this book and look at it, I've really come to believe that, these variety acts that also involved wrestling, strongman, all this, even the non-wrestling stuff worked in some sort of. It's kind of like it's a variety show. It's like Saturday Night Live. I think all the skits certainly are pre-planned. There may be some impromptu stuff. Definitely, the things like the illusion shows. Hypnosis was a big thing. Remember Dr. Mesmer, where you get the term mesmerizing. That he was contemporary to this time period, and a lot of that went on. And there would be a lot of kind of what we would today or in the modern era call TED Talks. You might have the early version of that where some philosopher, author, or oftentimes a minister would have some religious connotation, but also some sort of scholarly philosophy or something. They would come and give dissertations on that too. So I've said this many times. It comes from a Rush song. I'm sure you all know, but it's so applicable. The more things change, the more they stay the same. The same things in history just keep repeating. They just keep repeating in different forms, and that goes from everything from government and wars to your basic, simple leisures of life, culture, pop culture. What do people do to get through the day? Life has always been hard, and here in today's world, we often talk how difficult things are, and at times things are very difficult. The country's in the world, not just the country, the world's in a very sketchy place right now. But when you think about the modern comforts we have of electricity and instant entertainment through the airwaves and all the different things we had, cars and things even 150 years ago we didn't have, you still know how life can be challenging these days, and it's entertainment, it's culture and pop culture that help us get through that. That helps get by, and it's so interesting that even on that micro versus macro level, you see repetitions throughout history. This article from Jason says Duncan C. Ross to enter the ministry. Cleveland, Ohio, January 11th. Again, our year is 1885. The announcement was made last night that Duncan C. Ross, the famous Scotch athlete, has given up the saloon business, renounced athletics, and decided to enter the ministry. And as a matter of fact, we'll probably come across this same, I think I got this same exact article in the book, so if we come across this again, Just bear with me. It says, to a reporter who called upon him to ascertain the truthfulness of this report, Mr. Ross said, "Yes, I'm going to give up my saloon and shall wrestle no more. I've decided to enter the pulpit, and now am perfecting my plans for that purpose. I've written a letter to Trinity College, a theological seminary at Toronto, for admission, and I hope to obtain a favorable reply." I don't recall. Maybe it's in this other, but I think he got turned down, if I remember correctly. San Francisco Chronicle, February 3rd, 1885. Wrestling is very dead at present, but the intended visit of Duncan C. Ross may enliven things somewhat. Of course, Ross has changed his mind. He does not mean to give up wrestling and enter the ministry after all. What Ross said to the Cleveland newspapers was that he would retire from the saloon industry, forswear rum, and leave Cleveland. Ross professes to be anxious to meet Clarence Whistler in a wrestling encounter and will come to San Francisco to make overtures for a meeting with the champion. If he is successful in his match with Whistler, Ross will journey to Australia. Wow, this is building up to that fatal trip to Australia for Clarence Whistler here. Duncan C. Ross does not deny that he said he might study for the ministry. He wants to live a good Christian life, but he has no intention of entering Trinity College in Toronto. So that's what it was. He ended up not going. Albuquerque, February 1885. That talk about Duncan C. Ross, the athlete, abandoning his muscular career and joining the ministry was all gammon. It's an old-timey word there. It was a fine advertising dodge worthy of a great actress with $1 million worth of diamonds stolen from her and not much talent. Next thing we know, John L. Sullivan will be a weeping convert at a Methodist revival meeting. So they're having their little fun. Although in the paper in Arkansas quotes Ross as saying he is sincere about going there. But yeah, it's, I came across this and I didn't go very deep down this rabbit hole, although, Jason, to be honest with you, I absolutely wanted to. And I want to save some of these, and I want to try to come back and talk about the swordsman stuff as we get kind of deeper into it, because it's really outstandingly fascinating stuff, because we just don't think about that sort of thing anymore. I mean, we just don't. Let's get at least one of these Homer Lane articles from Jimmy Wheeler in here before our mid-show break, because I would like to get to at least a little of the timeline on this episode to move us forward chronologically. But in order to do that, let's go back and fill in any gaps we've left, and Jimmy Wheeler provides this. Now, he did this research, it's published December 15th, 2016. So we're talking roughly 9 years prior to the research that I did for the book. So don't know if we're going to get into some stuff that may be contradicted by later research or not. We'll see. But because Homer Lane, especially early information about Homer Lane, was hard to come by, there's not as much about him in the book as I'd hoped to have. But that's why we have this podcast. And thank you again, Jimmy. Those who have followed PWHS, which is Jimmy's website here. Those who have followed PWHS for a while will know I have several wrestlers which interest me a great deal more than others from the early days of professional wrestling. One of them is Homer Lane, a figure whose importance in the early development of professional wrestling, including a national touring expansion by the Northeast-based wrestlers. Putting together his story has been a constant up-and-down ride, like an old proverbial roller coaster ride, with the great periods of frustration and an occasional find that ignites motivation and excitement to pulling together the pieces of the puzzle. This time around, I'm certainly made some progress, just not necessarily in the manner I expected to. I decided to do some new searches in the various newspaper archives out there in case, by some chance, something new had been added. After all, surely someday an obituary must pop up for him. Yeah, I didn't find one either. How can a multiple-time wrestling champion, once considered the best collar and elbow wrestler in America by many, just disappear? If he if his path has gone into obscurity for some time, it wouldn't be so weird. But that's not the case. He had a match in 1894. And again, like I said, Homer Lane's career stretched a long time. He was over 60 years old when it took place and seemed to be still good friends with other wrestlers and sport personalities up to that time. Yet there is still no further information on his life after that show. Although I'd also checked both archives.com and Find a Grave before with no real faith anything new would be discovered, I still took a quick look to see if anything new had been updated, and there was nothing. I was about to resign to another period of no hope for ever finding anything out about the actual man that was Homer Lane. I threw up my hands in the air with a sigh and closed all the websites I'd left open during the last useless 2 hours. At that moment, I remembered I'd seen that Homer had a brother, or possibly it was his brother, who was an important figure in Lowville, Lewis County, New York, where they'd both been born. That had been the extent of my knowledge on Homer's personal life. Oh, and that he was born somewhere between 1830 and 1840, with 1834 to 1836 seeming quite likely. So I just threw up a quick Google search for information on Curtis G. Lane. Some family history for him actually started to appear, with a couple of dates and new names to look into from a book called A History of Lewis County. I decided to give the document archives another shot. So this is some good. This is deep in the weeds research here by Jimmy. I can certainly relate, and this is where you find a lot of this stuff, not in contemporary wrestling sources and other sources. You shocked oftentimes where you find stuff. Jimmy continues, while I did not find out what his date of death was, I did find out some pretty interesting things about his family's history. There may very well be other notable events in other branches of the tree that I've gone through, but I've tried to keep it all as relevant to Homer Lane as I could without neglecting anything as necessary or an interesting part of his family's history. The story that can be told today starts in England. It was in that jolly old place that William Lane was born around 1625. It's unclear whether he was sent over to America as a child in 1635 or if he came across later on in 1850, as there's no sign of his parents in America. I'd guess the latter. His first wife was Mary Kelway, and she was born circa 1630 and married William during 1651 in Boston, Massachusetts. As Boston was founded as a city just prior to 1630, it means William and Mary were fairly early to arrive in that area. Mary was a member of the First Church of Boston and died at a young age on May 2nd, 1656, while in labor with the couple's third child. William remarried just over a month later to, wow, that's quick. William remarried just over a month later to a lady named Mary Brewer. She was the sister of Sarah Webster, who was the ancestor of the famous American statesman Daniel Webster. William's firstborn holds the most interest. Born on January 23rd, 1651 in Boston, Samuel Lane married Sarah Dickinson. Sarah was the granddaughter of Nathaniel Foote, listed as the first explorer and one of, if not one of the most important founding fathers of Westerfield, Connecticut. According to the Foote Family Association, there are over 1 million descendants from Sarah's grandparents in the United States today, and some of them are actually rather well known. So I thought it would be best to include them, although there are more people of fame from that bloodline. Amelia Earhart, wow, from the Homer Lane ancestry. Sarah Jessica Parker, the actress. Hugh Hefner, yes, from Playboy fame. All some way distantly related to Homer Lane. 5 children, Jimmy says, came from Samuel and Sarah's marriage. By the time Samuel passed away in 1690, he and his family were living in Suffield, Connecticut. Once again, this Lane was one of the first guys to make Southfield, as it was called at the time, his family's home. I was quite surprised to find that Sarah actually remarried on February 22nd, 1691. Her husband, Martin Kellogg's mother, was Joanna Foote, the sister of Sarah's mother. Martin, like Sarah, had been married before and already had 2 children. Sarah had 5 children from Samuel. Then with Martin, she had another 4 children. They settled in Deerfield, Connecticut, which was soon in a war with the French and native North Americans. On February 29th, over 300 of the enemy invaded town with an intense raid that left 22 men, 9 women, and 25 children dead. One of the children was their son, Jonathan. Over 112 men, women, and children were captured and forced to march around 300 miles to a base in Quebec, Canada. Sarah, Martin, and their children, Rebecca, Joanna, Joseph, and Martin Jr., survived. The two boys returned home a few years after being released and worked as interpreters throughout their lives. Joanna married the chief of the Canasaga tribe of the Mohawks and stayed with them for life. Rebecca married a part Oaxaca tribesman. It may seem strange to us that they would unite with someone who had taken them rather than returning them home with the rest of their family. However, it was actually a fairly common practice by the natives to try and integrate the children they captured on such raids to replace their own young that they had lost. They lived with the tribe for some time, but Rebecca did eventually return home. She, like her brothers, often worked as an interpreter and a go-between between the Owaga tribe and the English settlers, which they'd been at war with. Her connection with the tribe was so strong they bestowed the nickname Wanasanya upon her. It roughly translates the bridge, for the obvious reason. One final notable event happened in her life, and that was becoming the first documented and thus known white woman to inhabit Broome County in New York. Once again, it is the firstborn male we are looking for to move down to the generations to Homer Lane. And, of course, the father was Samuel Lane, Sarah's first husband. He named his firstborn after himself when the young Samuel was brought into this world in 1680 in Massachusetts. Samuel Lane does not seem to have had much of a side story to his life, but he married someone named Abigail Hovey in 1709, lived there for another 60 years, giving her 5 children during those years. Let's see here. Get on down to Homer, see where Homer comes in. So on down the ancestral list, we get to Curtis. As Jimmy mentions, Curtis is the most noteworthy of all the children other than Homer Lane for his central role in the building of Lowville over the years, but also because he is the only Lane who Homer appears to have kept in touch with over the years. Initially, Curtis took over the farming business from Gad and kept this up until August 1st, 1870, when he sold the land and bought a small house for himself and his second wife, Eliza. Prior to his marriage with Eliza, Curtis had been married previously to someone who had passed away of an illness. They had some other children. Let's see here. Okay, so Brother Curtis G. Lane had been called to the celestial lodge above. Yes, he had passed away, and his seat among us is vacant. By his death, this is from a paper, by the way, written in 1880 speak. By his death, we are again reminded that the all-devoting scythe of time continues its sad and ceaseless havoc among the craft, from the fatal sweep of which none can escape. Was old-time fiery preaching going on right there. All right, so moving on down to Homer here. According to Lane in later interviews, he claimed to have wrestled for a circus at the age of 17 in 1851. As we know, he was actually 22 or 23 in 1851. So, yeah, maybe it sounds about right. He then went on tour of New York and Pennsylvania throughout the 1850s. It's not until after the Civil War in the 1860s that any regular mentions of him wrestling start to be frequently found, however. And that's nothing unusual, as sports in general didn't really gain regular coverage until after the Civil War anyway. There are actually 2 census entries for a Homer Lane in 1870, one for the 2nd District, 15th Ward, New York City, and the other for the 12th District, 15th Ward, New York City. The former is listed as working as an iron molder, while the latter is a lightning rod. While it is possible that, remember we come across that weird mention of Homer Lane, the lightning rod. Still not sure what that means, but here Jimmy mentions it again. Well, it's possible that this is the wrestler, and in both, the age used is the same as what the wrestler claimed to be. He had been wrestling in Michigan earlier that year and was already considered one of the best wrestlers in the Northeast. Not only that, but this Homer Lane, who appears to be the same Homer Lane in both entries, one was taken in July and the other in December. He has a wife called Carrier Caroline. There is no record that the wrestler ever had a wife. I think he's the lightning rod guy because he's referenced as that later on, I guess. And I don't, again, I don't want to, we have the world's information at our fingertips. Let's see if that's a 1800s term. 1800s term. And it may just mean he made lightning rods, but we looked at this before, and it was not conclusive. See if there was a term in the 1800s for this. The term to lightning, yeah, no, that's really not. So I don't know. Still don't know for sure. Let's take our mid-show break right here, and when we come back, we'll look and see during the break. I'm gonna look and see if there's anything else I want to get into right now on Homer Lane on this. If not, on the second half of the show, we're going to go back into the timeline a little bit. But let me look at this particular lineage of Homer Lane, see if anything jumps out right here, because we definitely want to go through some more of this stuff going forward, especially when Homer Lane comes up again. So let's take a quick break and come back right after this. Hey everybody, this is Carl Stern from WhenItWasCool.com. I'm here to tell you about my new book, now available, Dragon King Karl's Pioneer Era Pro Wrestling Omnibus, the Bible of the Pioneer Era of professional wrestling. Pro wrestling didn't start with Frank Gotch. He didn't just appear out of the void to bring us entertainment-style professional wrestling. No, it was built on a legacy some 70 to 80 years old. That's what I'm going to talk to you about, an era of wrestling in America seldom ever discussed, never before in this detail. I have put 700 pages of information about the pioneers of professional wrestling, like William Muldoon, Colonel James H. McLaughlin, Professor Thiebaud Bauer, Clarence Whistler, William Miller, and so many more. Maybe some names you've never heard of before, maybe some you've only heard in passing. I will tell you the origins and evolution. Now available, Amazon.com, WhenItWasCool.com. All right, we're back for the second half of the show. Today's show's fresh as it can be. Usually, because all my shows, the Dragon King Karl shows, we talk about pop culture, retro pop culture, pro wrestling history, and more. They're evergreen shows. That's why our archive of audio at When It Was Cool is, such a selling point for us, because it's all, it's biographies, it's stories about the past. So these are evergreen stories. And so our 3,000 or so podcasts we have in our archive, all these, unless, someone passes away that we previously done a biography of or something, these are all relevant shows still to this day. So hope you'll check that out on our Patreon feed at When It Was Cool. Jenny sent around this really good timeline. I'm a sucker for timelines, right? 1828 is what he has here. July 14th, 1828. Lowville, Lewis County, New York. Homer Lane, the youngest of 9 children, is born here to Gad Lane and Perry Gold. And again, is this right? Is this correct? I don't know. I don't have a date of birth for him, I don't think. 1845, so pre-Civil War here. The circus in Lowville, New York, taking on all comers. Homer Lane defeated a circus wrestler. It said the wrestler had already beaten up his competitors and wrestled half a dozen members of the audience. Lane states that in later on down the road, Homer Lane said his first match was at 17 years old. And this information, by the way, is taken from an interview with Homer Lane in 1886. So that's his word on what happened there. 1852, Troy, New York. H. Becker defeated Homer Lane. This note is mentioned in an article featuring the Articles of Agreement between H.A. Brink and H. Becker for their upcoming contest in 1877. So neat, the callback to an older match there. That's where that information comes from. So pretty interesting stuff here. And here's one. Then we'll move to the timeline. September 1865. September 2nd, 1865. Cold Spring Mile Track in New York. Winner to face Homer Lane. It says Homer Lane, quote, the celebrated lightning rod man, versus someone we don't know and the results unknown. So again, it looks like Homer Lane probably was involved in making lightning rods and became known for that. Interesting early, very interesting early nickname. Nicknames in wrestling, well, they've been around as forever too, as we've saw. So much of this stuff just repeats in history. All right, so now let's go a little further into our timeline, and for this, we go to my most recent book, which I hope, if you don't have a copy of, I hope you will get it very soon. It is DragonKingKarl's Pioneer Era Pro Wrestling Omnibus. It came out less than a year ago, and still selling very well. The book's selling quite good. If you don't have a copy or you're just new to this, please, this is my foundational work. This is what I've spent over 30 years of research doing, is putting together a true, non-kayfabed, analytical history of the Pioneer Era of wrestling. Before wrestling, how did a wrestling arrive at Frank Gotch? Frank Gotch didn't just beam out of the sky and start, winning championships. No, he had more than 50 years of sporting history and championships here in the United States to build off of. So we're going to go, let's start in December of 1882. We may have got a little into December, but we're going to start to begin in December 1882. December 1882, December 8th, Lowell, Massachusetts. It is reported a few weeks after the fact that Andre Cristal had dislocated his shoulder while wrestling Edward Farron. So Andre Cristal now with an injury. December 9th, 1882. Cincinnati, Ohio. After being largely out of the spotlight for some time, Professor Thiebaud Bauer returns to the newspapers, essentially issuing a wrestling challenge specifically aimed at William Muldoon. And Bauer is going to stage a substantial comeback here. December 16th, 1882, Baltimore, Maryland. The Concordia Opera House, attendance 400 people. Edwin Bibby defeated Tom Cannon, Greco-Roman Wrestling, 2 out of 3 falls. December the 18th, 1882, New York City, New York, Madison Square Garden. Joe Acton wrestled. Joe Acton has just recently entered our story here, so pay attention to mentions of his name, and we'll learn what we can about Joe Acton. Not one of the names I think a lot of people think of first when think of the Pioneer Era, but he certainly was a very substantial name and a champion, no doubt. He wrestled the World Mixed Styles Champion, Clarence Whistler, to a draw in front of a reported 3,500 fans. Match lasted 2 hours without a fall. Edwin Bibby was the referee. This match got more newspaper coverage than any other match in many years, with virtually the same word-for-word report running in newspapers across the United States. Quote, an international wrestling match for $2,000. Some papers inserted $10,000 for some reason. And the championship of the world between Clarence Whistler of Kansas and Joe Acton of Philadelphia will come off at Madison Square Garden on December 18th. So that's the match we just spoke of. Also on the 18th, Cleveland, Ohio, Duncan C. Ross defeated O.E. Pooler to retain the Police Gazette Championship medal, winning 2 falls in 3 minutes. What I was going to say a moment ago, sidetrack there. This show is very fresh. I'm recording it actually the day you hear, the day I drop it, that Sunday I dropped it and recorded the show that same day. I just slipped my mind. This was the weekend. We do 1,000 hours every other Sunday. So if you want to catch the entire archives, on our off week, that'd be a great use of it. And then it's not necessarily you listen to all these episodes in order, although we're putting together largely a chronological history right now of the era. But look, there's been so little done on the Pioneer Era of wrestling. You can't help but go wrong just by grabbing a random episode. You're going to probably learn something about someone you've perhaps never heard of. Maybe you've heard of them, maybe you don't know that much about them. But man, I tell you what, as someone who's researched this Pioneer Era stuff for 30 years or more, I learned so much more than I ever knew. There's been so much misinformation reported over the years. it is just hard to weave through. It wasn't even necessarily the stuff I didn't know, although there was plenty I didn't know about the Pioneer era that I learned through the process of researching this book. But what I didn't count on was that so much of what I thought I knew was wrong. So much of the stuff that had been reported over the years by historians and in books, and most of this stuff comes from books in the early 1900s. That a lot of that information was wrong, and we've just built a history of the Pioneer era of wrestling that was on a very shaky foundation, where there were several building it on premises that were incorrect. And now, at least with this book, any future historians, and this is my final word on the Pioneer era, that, and this podcast. I've laid the foundation. I've done the heavy lifting, and now I hope others can pull sections or entries from the book and build off that. And I hope they find all kinds of things to add to, and if anything needs to be corrected, I hope that's all done in the future, and so we can get really a definitive history of the origin and evolution of pro wrestling down to something that's truthful and honest. December the 23rd, 1882, go to Cincinnati, Ohio. At the Coliseum, the attendants said it was an immense crowd. William Muldoon defeated Professor Thiebaud Bauer in Greco-Roman wrestling 3 out of 5 falls. So here we see Muldoon hooking back up with Bauer again. Despite the fact Muldoon and Bauer and Muldoon and Miller and eventually Muldoon and Whistler as well, everybody William Muldoon worked with, he ended up having a falling out with at some point in time. December 24th, Christmas Eve, 1882, in Fremont, Ohio, Lucian Mark Cristal defeated Heinrich Weber in Greco-Roman. It was said to be for the Lightweight Championship of America. On the same night, Lucian Mark also wrestled Richard Detrelli and defeated him as well. Worked show, undoubtedly. December the 27th, 1882, wrestler Matt Grace, who is part of Harry Hill's group of wrestlers. We've talked about Matt Grace quite a bit. He is arrested for being in possession of stolen diamonds in New York City. And look, Matt Grace's life and career goes downhill from here. He's going to die young as well. He was never a big, like one of your top tier, top shelf name. Like he was never in the Colonel McLaughlin or John McMahon level. He was down, so he was more like a Captain J.C. Dally level wrestler as far as I can ascertain from the papers and stuff. But he was around regular enough that you got used to seeing his name. He was he had a brother that wrestled as well. December the 28th, 1882, New York City, Madison Square Garden. Attendance 2,500 people. A charity mixed event show, several sparring matches and boxing took place, along with an exhibition collar and elbow demonstration between Edris Gus Lambert from Canada and Black Sam, Vero Small. Yes, there's Black Sam again. December the 30th, 1882, we'll go to St. Louis, Missouri. Professor Thiebaud Bauer defeated Fritz Muller in Greco-Roman wrestling. Bauer threw Muller numerous times. The match was supposed to continue on the 31st, but the building manager wouldn't allow it, saying the two were too unevenly matched, and the newspapers treated it as an obvious exhibition. 1883. So now we're going to begin the year 1883 as we're clicking along now. We're deep into the Pioneer era. Up to this point in time, your roughly chronologically, your major names post-Civil War have been Colonel James H. McLaughlin, who beat Homer Lane, who we just talked about, for that American Championship following the 1870 Detroit International Tournament. We've had John McMahon. We've got Duncan C. Ross in there now. H.M. Doofer, We've seen this progression come along. John McMahon's still around, but he's not that dominant anymore. He's starting to have a lot of physical problems. Most of his matches seem like obvious and maybe even egregious works. But here's where he's at beginning 1883, January 7th. John McMahon goes to the offices of the National Police Gazette and says that he is still the American collar and elbow champion. No, he's not really, but he says he is. He's considering retiring from wrestling, but wants to wrestle H.M. Doofer for the championship before he does. January the 11th, 1883, Cleveland, Ohio, at Ryan's Gym, Duncan C. Ross defeated John Thayer in a handicap match, throwing him 9 times in 72 minutes. Duncan C. Ross told the Cleveland papers that he is now returning to New York to wrestle Thayer, and he is now ready to give up wrestling and return to being a trapeze acrobat, of which he is an expert. So here, the multifaceted Duncan C. Ross, swordsman, trapeze acrobat, wrestler. Very interesting stuff here, to be sure. Minister, perhaps. January 13th, 1883, Louisville, Kentucky. The Opera House, John Graham defeated Clarence Whistler in a mixed-style match when Whistler suffered another serious shoulder injury and the match had to be stopped. 2 out of 3 falls. A fall had been won by each when Whistler was thrown hard on his shoulder. The referee, R.M. Ramsey, awarded the fall and the prize money of $5,000 to John Graham. January 17th, 1883, Professor Thiebaud Bauer tells the New York Times that he has heard that his old running mate, Professor William Miller, was defeated in Australia by a giant Maori named Herbert A. Slade. All right, so let's talk about Herbert A. Slade for a minute. Many times, if you go through the book, DragonKingKarl's Pioneer Era Pro Wrestling Omnibus, you will discover things about the same time I discover things. Okay, I'm going through this book. I'm looking for wrestlers and wrestling, and especially by this point, 1883, it's largely, I'm way past it's being worked, or as they called it at the time, hippodromed or put up job or whatever. So I'm long over that. And I'm more looking to how closely did this resemble modern pro wrestling? So here we have this giant Maori. He's a boxer too. So this giant, Polynesian guy named Herbert Slade, they're bringing him into the United States as a boxer, but the giant Maori, it's all over the paper. So I'm like, man, I gotta know more about the giant Maori, Herbert Slade. Well, prepare to be as disappointed as I was when we get to the physical dimensions of one Herbert Slade. But here's Herbert Slade is mentioned. Duncan C. Ross wants to wrestle him. Professor Thiebaud Bauer wants to wrestle him. January 27, 1883, St. Louis, Missouri, at the Masonic Hall. Largest attendance ever to witness an event in this city, says the newspaper. William Muldoon defeated Professor Thiebaud Bauer in Greco-Roman wrestling, 2 out of 3 falls. The entire match lasted 26 minutes. The giant Maori Slade, in quotation marks, whom the wrestlers have been challenging in the newspaper, arrives in New York. Richard K. Fox will have him boxing instead, along with the help of Harry Hill. Already, look, if Richard K. Fox and Harry Hill are working together on a gimmick giant boxer, this is straight out of Barnum's Geological Hippodrome here in 1883. You can just imagine like they've got dry ice fog, coming down the plank of a ship. Everyone's standing around in their properly dressed attire with their hats on or scribbling in their notepads when out of the smoke comes this fearsome man beast from wherever he's from. He's going to come out and he's going to destroy these. Well, not so much. Slade, the giant Maori Slade, is the protege of boxer Jim Mace, though Slade says he has a background in Cumberland-style wrestling also. By the way, this giant stands 6 foot 2 inches tall and weighs 225 pounds, per the New York Times. Look, Colonel McLaughlin was bigger than this guy. John McMahon was maybe a little shorter, but roughly, he's by no means are these great wrestlers hugely overshadowed by this 6 foot 2, 225 pound Herbert Slade. who really doesn't become much of anything, quite honestly. January the 28th, 1883, New Orleans, Louisiana Cockpit. That's the name, and it's in bold. So we got a Dragon King Carl note coming up to talk about the cockpit. Theodore Greek George defeated Thorol Olson in Greco-Roman wrestling, 2 straight falls. Now, the Dragon King Carl note I know you're all awaiting to get to. Okay, after the 12-year-old kid inside you stops laughing at the name, let's get serious for a minute. Times have changed, and pro wrestling has never had the best reputation. But during the 1800s, it was not uncommon for wrestling to be paired with cock or rooster fighting and dog fights as well at a venue. All were gambling sports and oftentimes took place on the same card or in the same building, especially in New Orleans, Louisiana, where they had a lot of that went on. January 30th, 1833, Norwich, Connecticut, Edris. Gus Lambert defeated Black Sam, Sphero Small, for the Connecticut State Championship. Don't know a lot about this particular Connecticut State Championship, but periodically we've seen some state championships. February 4th, 1883, in St. Louis, Missouri, the Olympic Theater, attendance 3,000 people. William Muldoon defeated Edwin Beebe and Greco-Roman wrestler, or Edwin Beebe. Remember, the newspaper told us we were all pronouncing the name wrong. Edwin Beebe and Greco-Roman wrestling, winning 1 fall. The match was agreed to last 2 hours, with the winner, the person getting the most falls. Muldoon took a fall in 7 minutes. No other fall was taken, and the match lasted 2 hours. This prompts a Dragon King Carl note. Former Missouri Governor Charles P. Johnson had threatened to try to get the match shut down for anyone involved arrested for violating various ordinances which prevented sports from taking place on Sunday. Now, I've alluded to this previously several times. William Muldoon had a good thing going with these exhibition shows. He was traveling around the country. Greco-Roman wrestling had been brought over from the circuses of France, largely practiced by Professor Thiebaud Bauer, Professor William Miller, Andre Cristal, Lucien Marc, those types. It was a theatrical style. It was almost every newspaper that watched it proclaimed it fake, just to the common eyesight. Anybody could tell this is a hippodrome or put on job or whatever. William Muldoon rises through the New York City Police Department, helps found an athletic club for which he excels in he and others excel in wrestling. And he is a pupil of Professor William Miller until it all falls apart, and Miller has him half beat to death in the streets of New York by another police officer, no less, and that all falls apart. But somehow, Muldoon ends up working again with Bauer and Miller, but at the same time, he has rehabilitated the image of Greco-Roman wrestling. So he starts going around the country after he quits the police force. They didn't want him to wrestle. He goes around the country putting on these exhibitions, and it's clearly announced as such. He's going around with people like Andre Cristal and Clarence Whistler, and they're putting on matches, and in between falls, they're explaining what they've done. This is a physical culturist course to the people that are attended, and the newspapers love this. The crowd seems to love it. And William Muldoon almost single-handedly rehabilitates the public perception of Greco-Roman wrestling until February of 1883, where William Muldoon gets himself some bad press. He's going to be wrestling on a Sunday. Now, to a heathen like William Muldoon, I don't know. William Muldoon may have been a very pious man. I don't think so, but perhaps. But nevertheless, I don't think he thought much about this. We saw wrestling kind of run up against these Sunday laws. We've talked about, there's still some states, Alabama included, still has some cities that, on Sunday, there's certain types of stores can't be open. It's not just liquor stores. It's not just things like that. It's like clothing stores. And people should not be, this is the old Puritan way of thinking, people should not be out on the Sabbath, which, of course, Sunday's not the Sabbath. We overlooked that part, but whatever. Anyway, on the Sabbath of buying clothes, it is for, is for attending church and not other, menial activities. And those laws stayed around for a while. Well, in 1883, they took this stuff seriously. These laws hadn't yet been, and in some states still aren't, unconstitutional, and the police were called in to shut these down. Well, this caused a real problem for Muldoon. He kind of took a licking over this in the public opinion, field of public opinion. And this is one of the rare missteps, I would say, of William Muldoon in just simply here in St. Louis having this wrestling match run over into a Sunday. It happened before. He had even done it before, but this time, for whatever reason, it got the attention of the governor. Yes, the governor of Missouri. Governor Charles P. Johnson said, "There'll be no wrestling upon Sundays," which is not the Sabbath, but we're going to call it the Sabbath here in our great state of Missouri. And so it's interesting. So the Dragon King Karl note in its full, and I'll quit clowning around here. Says former Missouri Governor Charles P. Johnson had threatened to try to get the match shut down if anyone involved or arrested for violating various ordinances which prevented sports from taking place on Sunday. Ultimately, Johnson chose not to get involved, and the chief of police declined to stop the match as well. However, a deputy was there with an arrest warrant for William Muldoon. Muldoon explained that he was not responsible for putting on the event, and the deputy declined to serve the warrant. And there was an outcry in numerous papers across the United States that a public wrestling match was allowed to take place on a Sunday. And look, hey, if you're new to us and you're just joining us, you're just jumping into the pioneer waters in 1883, wrestling had gone through this before. Wrestling had come across these blue laws a few times, and they're going to come across them again. I think down in Louisiana, there's going to be a big dust up there as well. And ultimately, of course, these, but it would be well into the 1900s. I can remember even as a kid in the 1970s, man, here in the Bible Belt of the Deep South, people just didn't do anything on Sundays. I mean, they might go to the lake and might go fishing, something pretty benign like that. But as far as any type of major, certainly no work, nobody's mowing their yard or anything like that on Sunday. And that was, I saw that well into my childhood here. February the 7th, 1883. A wrestling match between Duncan C. Ross and American collar and elbow champion John McMahon was canceled at Madison Square Garden in New York City, New York, when it was discovered that building owner William K. Vanderbilt's business license had expired. It's the very person who had Madison Square Garden, William K. Vanderbilt, famous family. Yes, he let his business license expire. Now, on the same day, February 7th, 1883, Kansas City, Missouri, at the Comique Theater, in front of a large crowd, Clarence Whistler defeated Professor Thiebaud Bauer in Greco-Roman wrestling, 2 straight falls lasting 33 minutes. So what we're going to do, we're going to tap out right there, except for our Patreon supporters. Stick around, and when we come back, we're not going down any more of the timeline, but we will talk some more Pioneer-era wrestling right after this.
We depend on Patreon support for our website and podcast network. In order to continue these podcasts you enjoy, we need you to visit whenitwascool.com and pledge at least $1. You'll gain access to lots of exclusive podcasts, newsletters, and more. Sign up is quick, simple, and can be canceled at any time. Whenitwascool.com and click any Patreon link. Thank you.